No intro today. Just starting. Deal with it. So I said last time that there was one more reform movement that we weren't really dealing with yet, and I think it just deserved its own episode, so that's really what I did, because it's so important to the Civil War and to what the country was going through at the time, and that's abolition. So it's very important to remember that abolition means to get rid of slavery. In this case, you can abolish all sorts of things in real life, but back then, the abolitionist movement, or abolition, was to get rid of slavery, and abolitionist is someone who supports abolition of slavery, so someone who supports getting rid of slavery, and the abolition movement is what we might call it, or the abolitionist movement is what we might call it. So the first thing we need to remember that is so interesting, at least to me, so there you go, I'm your teacher, is that most Northerners are not abolitionists. Most Northerners do not like the concept of slavery, do not want slavery to spread throughout the country, but they do not think that we should actively go and stop the South from having slaves. It's thought of as a kind of a regional difference, rather than something that needs to go and get taken out. Abolitionists definitely think that the government or Northerners or whatever, someone needs to go to the South and stop slavery from happening. But most Northerners are not abolitionists. Some Northerners just don't care at all, even if slavery moves west. Most Northerners probably wouldn't want slavery to move west. So abolitionists, what does that look like? What do they want? Well, the first kind of version of this, version 1.0, is something called the Colonization Society, which is one of those kind of ugh moments in history, because their hearts maybe were in a good place, but when you really dig down into what the Colonization Society is about, they don't fit with our values, at least. So their whole plan was they were going to raise money, and they did actually raise a lot of this money, and they were going to buy slaves. Now, they aren't buying slaves to use them for labor. They're buying slaves to free them. And what are they going to do once they free them? They're going to put them on a ship, and they're going to send them to Africa. This is actually where the country of Liberia got its first kind of setup, and where it gets its initial where it becomes its own country, and one of the reasons it never suffered from imperialism later in history, at least not in the same way as a lot of other African countries did. So the Colonization Society relies on the fact that slavery is bad, but we shouldn't be living with certain races together. We should make sure that we remain separate. It kind of ignored the fact that most of the folks who had been enslaved who are being freed have never been to Africa. Don't know a lot about that. And so you're still kind of working from a racist viewpoint, which is one of the reasons it doesn't always mesh well with our modern way of looking at things. It's not about living together. It's just about kind of ending slavery. And it really had a relatively minor effect on slavery itself. Slavery is still thriving even while this is going on. So there's a couple of famous abolitionists that we're going to talk about real quick. One of the first is William Lloyd Garrison. He published a paper for 30 years called The Liberator, and it talked about how evil slavery was. It was a strong anti-slavery newspaper, and it was a pretty important one. He kind of called the Civil War early, was totally fine with that happening. He knew it was about slavery, and it was one of those interesting things. He also was pretty radical for the time, and then he called for equal rights, not just the abolition of slavery. You got Frederick Douglass, who ends up publishing his own paper. You've read some of his autobiography, and that work and his speaking actually does a lot to further the cause of abolitionists, and that he was an escaped slave and was able to talk about things firsthand. Another game-changing abolitionist was Harriet Beecher Stowe. She wrote a novel. She actually wasn't necessarily she didn't set out to be some great abolitionist, but she actually, I believe, was in Cincinnati when she met slaves on the Underground Railroad and learned about what slavery was like. So she wrote a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin, one of the most banned books of all time, but also one of the best-selling books of all time. And it was all about showing what slavery was kind of actually like, but it was in the form of a novel. So you care about the characters, you get to know them, and then you see kind of the horrors of slavery. And it sold a lot in the North and in Europe. So actually, when the Civil War comes, which is going to be 8 or 9 years after Uncle Tom's Cabin, a lot of European countries don't want to intervene because they don't believe in slavery, and Uncle Tom's Cabin is going to play a big role in that, as well as turning a lot of Northerners into maybe that I don't care group into that abolitionist group. So that's a pretty big deal for a novel to accomplish, which is pretty impressive. The second part of abolition I want to talk about, which is pretty cool, is the Underground Railroad. So these are the folks who aren't just writing articles about, we need to end slavery. These are the ones who are putting into action helping slaves escape. So it's a network of abolitionists. It's not a literal railroad. Not a lot of people, get confused about that. But if you are a slave and you want to leave the plantation, and obviously you're not supposed to do that, so you can get in big trouble. But if you do, the Underground Railroad is a group of people, white and black, rich and poor, all sorts of types of people, who are all combined in that they're abolitionists, and they'll help you escape. And they'll help you either get settled in a northern state or in Canada. As more and more anti-fugitive slave acts get passed, which I'll talk about in later lectures, you kind of have to make it all the way to Canada if you want to be secure in your freedom. And it can be a very dangerous journey. So you need people to help you on the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman is going to be the most famous person on this Underground Railroad as far as helping folks. And she kept going back to the South, and she helped free hundreds of slaves from bondage. So she was a pretty big deal. And I encourage you to look up. Underground Railroad is one of those things in history that's pretty interesting to learn about and pretty cool. I can't dedicate a ton of time to it here, so I actually kind of encourage you to look that up on your own. And so, kind of in summary, it's going to be a pretty quick one. It's important to remember that there were a lot of Northerners who probably didn't like slavery, but were not about to go to the South and force change about it. Once you talk about America expanding westward, it gives Northerners and Southerners something else to argue about. There were abolitionists out there. The thoughts and ideas were out there. We should have equality. We should have people being free. They were considered extreme at the time, which is interesting because a lot of the way that we talk now about equality, liberty, freedom, that language was still out there. It just didn't necessarily apply to everybody. So that's interesting to me in any case. But all this abolitionism, all of this Underground Railroad stuff is going to really increase tension between the North and the South. And that's what we're going to start talking about more is tension. We're going to talk about that next time. It's going to be all those things that just gnaw at two sides. But we'll talk about that later. And I hope y'all are doing well and keep on keeping on. Until next time.